everybody. Welcome to the historic Leonard Theater, where Freedom Summer 64 training in the historic Peabody Hall, former home of Western College for Women. This is a program of the Western Academic Program, as well as the Western Center for Social Impact and Innovation. I am Dr. Jacqueline Doherty. I direct the center, and I have the pleasure of just doing a brief introduction of Dr. Mark Mussman, who will be talking to us tonight about gentrification, affordable housing, and Cincinnati. Dr. Mussman is a doctor because he and I went through the same graduate program at the University of Cincinnati with the same advisor. So I've been learning from Mark for over a decade now, and I'm excited to be able to share him with the larger Miami community. Those both in person in Leonard Theater and those streaming live, welcome. Mark is the Director of Education at the Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition. So everything that he's going to be talking about tonight really comes from his experience on the ground, working and living in the Over the Rhine community with people who are experiencing homelessness. Mark also recently just published his first book, is that right? Hey. Steal the Street. And it is a collection of a number of essays that he's written over the years about his observations and experiences working in that community. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mark.
So we're going to start briefly with a video from Melissa Mosby, who's one of our speakers and facilitators at the Homeless Coalition. She really wanted to be here tonight, so she share this video with us. So hopefully we'll be able to hear it okay.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Mussman for allowing me to be a part of this great event. Steal the Street. Wow. I believe that's exactly what is happening in Cincinnati. Our streets are being stolen by profit mongers so hungry for profit and with so little regard for humanity that not only do they act to almost eradicate low-income housing in Cincinnati, but they go even further by criminalizing people experiencing homelessness. Through Steal the Street, Dr. Mark has taken me on a journey through Cincinnati, our past, our present, and what could be our future if we act now to claim our streets, our human rights, our self-respect, and our communities. Thank you again, Dr. Mark, for allowing me to be a part of this celebration. Thank you also for keeping it clear, educational, motivating, and true. You guys have a good night.
Thank you all, everybody, for being here today. I'm Dr. Mark, the Director of Education at the Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition, and I have been spending the day with great Miami students and professors, and hopefully we had some sort of beginning of a conversation. And hopefully tonight we'll continue that conversation, but it won't end here. Oftentimes when we hear words like gentrification and homelessness, it becomes very unclear, and they can also stop conversations. So I implore you to use this as a beginning of a conversation, a larger conversation that affects us all. So we have a clicker, I guess. This is fancy, right? So I do want to thank the Homeless Coalition and all our member organizations. We have about 65 member organizations that provide direct services. They provide housing and shelter, clothing, food, medical services, legal services, as well as just spiritual services, right? There's parts of us that are often incomplete when we're affected by structural violence and other parts of society that we need each other to build those. I also want to thank Street Vibes. If you're not familiar with Street Vibes is a street paper that's put out by the Homeless Coalition, and it's an alternative to panhandling. So instead of people just holding a sign, which is okay, they're able to ask for a donation for this paper. And one of the great parts about it is that anybody could write for it. We're always looking for student voices, folks in the community who are experiencing different things to share their experience with others, because this is a counter narrative to basically mass media, right? These are things that you read in here, you're not going to get in other news sources. So please support that. I also want to thank Alice Skirts, who is here today, an author of Econocide. If you really want to get the background information of what's in Steal the Street, I suggest you get this book. It is organized very well into different sections covering different things like public space, and it has lots of notes and lots of sources. So this is also a good place. So if you want to learn more, please pick up Econocide and check that out. And thank you so much for being here. And of course, writing the foreword to the book. I want to thank Jackie for having us here today and making this connection with so many Western students, but also some graduates that are here, professors that I've been seeing in 20 years. Don't let me cry over here. And I also want to thank Rodney Coates, who gave us some time in his class today, who was also on my dissertation committee, even though he was here at Miami. So, and I want to thank you all for making the time to be here today, whether virtually or in person. For those of you who are online, there's a ton of people in the room, which is really exciting. So exciting. So I want to thank that. And I also want to thank the people that I've learned from. So not only our speakers from our Speakers Bureau, people who are experiencing homelessness or have in the past, but the people who we've been working to organize to secure basic constitutional rights, freedom of speech. You know, if you're living in a tent, that is saying there's not enough housing, there's not enough affordable housing or shelter space, right? The freedom from against seizures of people's stuff or cruel and unusual punishment. Should you be able to just be thrown in jail because you don't have a place to stay tonight? And unfortunately, in Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is, you can be thrown in jail just because you're experiencing homelessness. The criminalization of homelessness is pervasive in our society, and people often just write it off like, oh, it's not going to affect me, so what does it matter? But these are our constitutional rights that we're defending, which is really important. So I want to thank everybody that I've been learning from throughout these years. Now, if you want to learn more, you can get your phone out and you can QR code this, or go to Brown Paper Tickets. We're doing our public education program coming up next month, so it's like in next week, so it'll be good. And Melissa and I lead these Homelessness 101, Affordable Housing 201, and 301 and 401, and these are 2-hour virtual courses that you can just zoom in and you can check it out and you can get in depth on these topics. So we're not going to get in depth on all this stuff, but I do want to give you some basic background information, but there's definitely more. And if you want to come in person, we do walking tours. So these are in-person walking tours in Over the Rhine, where we talk about the history, but also what's happening today, so that you can see what gentrification looks like and how it's affecting people in the community. So we have those. We have another tour, and then also our speakers at the end of the month, or towards the end of the month, for our speaker week for National Homelessness Awareness Week, which is the week before Thanksgiving. And Willa and Sam will also be sharing their experience, and that'll be virtually. So you can tune in on those dates, get your tickets at Brown Paper Tickets, sliding scale, pay what you want to support the education program. So what is Street Vibes? Now I mentioned that it is a street paper, and many cities do have street papers across the country. Street Vibes is the longest continuously run paper in North America, though. We have that distinction at this point, but it existed even before that as a newsletter, a community newsletter, and there's a long tradition of people who want to get information, but also share their perspective. Out at Peaslee Neighborhood Center is an important place in our neighborhood, and they say things like, you know, expression is the first step out of oppression, right? So if you keep things bottled up inside, you often don't know that you're being treated unfairly. But when you talk to somebody and you can compare your experience, then you start to understand how you're being treated. So we often people ask us, you know, what should we do when we see somebody who's panhandling? You know, what am I supposed to do? And people often freeze and they're like, I don't know what to do. And the best thing to do is treat people with respect. You know, the eye contact, say, how are you doing? If you don't have anything to give, that's fine. But just like you, no one likes to be ignored, right? That's the number one thing, is when you ignore people, you're basically saying that they don't have value. And we understand that everybody has value. So these covers here, as you can see, are just some of the many that are included in the book Steal the Street. So part of my job at the Homeless Coalition is to write articles every 2 weeks. That's a pretty rapid number, that's a rapid schedule, right? And so what I would do is I would say, what pictures did I take that week? Can I make a story out of this? What's the story here? Because when you walk around a neighborhood that's changing rapidly, from one month to the next, things are changing, it's often very important to take pictures. And so that's why we had the gallery show to say, like, look, these things are changing quickly and they're changing rapidly. So I would often just take out my phone and say, what did I take a picture of? And then how does this relate? I would say, what are the topics that people are talking about today? How can I get this information to other people in an educational way? I wasn't very good at it at first. I will tell you that the articles I write now are very strong because I look at it from the perspective that the person reading this doesn't know anything, right? Because a lot of our experiences are completely different. So in Steal the Street, it builds and builds and builds because I was kind of assuming people know some stuff, right? That they've read Econo-Side. But they haven't yet, right? You haven't yet, but you will get that. So a lot of the stories really started off as an idea. What's the thing I want to convey today? And a lot of those came out of my work that I had done previously with GED students, adults working to get their GEDs, through my AmeriCorps experience tutoring. And what are they talking about? What are their experiences? And how can I relate these experiences to other people? So unfortunately, the hundreds of pictures that were in the articles are not in the book. I had to pick just the ones that I thought were most important. And when I filtered through those, it started those pictures themselves tell a story. So when you get the book, just flip through and look at the pictures as you go along and see what kind of story does that tell as we're going along. So, there's a picture of me down there with students. One of the best parts of my job is working with college students doing alternative breaks. And I wish that the Miami students in here would get your alternative break program going really strong. Because when you have an opportunity to go to a community and learn from people in that community, it's life-changing really within hours, because you have your own conceptions of what things are going to go, and it doesn't go that way. That's one of the things I've learned with working with community groups is you can't be a perfectionist, right? Not at all. So really quickly, I did want to talk about the types of homelessness, because a lot of times there's an article in there called I Didn't Know. There are people that I've talked to and that have come up to us after a speaking engagement or after a training and say, I didn't know I was experiencing homelessness. I didn't know that when I was living with my cousin and I was couch surfing, that was experiencing homelessness. Because a lot of times we think it's just people who are sleeping on the street or in a shelter, right? It's not the people who are doubled up, the families living together, or the people who are couch surfing, or the kids that are homeless at home, meaning they have a roof over their head, but they don't have maybe their own bedroom, or they don't have food on the table, or they don't have parental guidance, right? So these types of homelessness affect all the communities all across this country. There are people experiencing homelessness in Indian Hill. Wow, did I just say that, right? Because there are people who are living with family members and all that kind of stuff. So one thing that we encourage you all to do is try to use person-first language. So instead of saying a homeless person or homeless people, which erases the face off of people and puts a tag on them that can't be removed, we encourage you to use person-first language, a family that's living outside or a person who's experiencing homelessness, to show not only that hopefully their experience of homelessness is temporary and not related to who they are, but that homelessness is a more widespread issue than people want to admit. So if you make it like, oh, it's this really specific thing, then people don't relate to it as much, but understanding that's more widespread. So countering those stereotypes about homelessness is important. Understanding that loneliness, isolation, and depression are risk factors for drug abuse, And those are things that you feel when you're experiencing homelessness. Because we don't go out here and say, oh, I'm experiencing homelessness, right? And understanding that the stereotypes are harmful to people, because then we don't see them for who they are, but we see them for the stereotype that they represent to us. It's really important. They always ask, well, do you need a PhD to do this job? I don't, but it's important for me to take the research that's presented to us, or the studies that the city comes out with, and to read those deeply, and then help translate those for the other folks that are doing the advocacy work, for the groups that are fighting back and saying, yeah, this is what they're saying and this is why it's wrong, right? Because you need to look at the sources, you need to go deeper. And then listening to the stories of people who are experiencing homelessness, or whose housing is threatened. People who are either being told that they have to move out because we're going to move other people in here, or just people who are living on the street because that's the safest and best option for them at that time. So ultimately, gentrification is displacement. It's kind of a very simple way to think about it, but it's true. It's that people and places, organizations and services, they are pushed out or they're closed down. And some folks might say, well, we don't need them anymore. But the reality is that people need help because they're working jobs that don't pay enough. They're discriminated against in their housing, in their workplace, in their schooling, they're redlined in healthcare. So all these things, we need to have a safety net. And when people are pushed out of their community, that safety net is often lost. And that leads to people dying earlier. This leads to more interactions with the police. And that police interaction can be deadly, as we've seen with people like Jarari Porter or Joanne Burton, who was run over by a police officer as she laid on our blanket in Washington Park. So this type of over-policing has a direct impact on folks. But there are two types of gentrification: direct gentrification and indirect gentrification. So direct gentrification is simply when people are pushed out directly out of their home. And you can do this in many different ways in the state of Ohio because we lack the housing protections that we need to ensure that people aren't put out. So often people will get a 45-day notice. And in the state of Ohio, legally, you have to give people a calendar month. So they'll give it to them on the 15th, and then you have that next calendar month to move out. People's leases are not renewed. You've got a developer saying, well, we're rehabbing it, so you got to go while we rehab it. Or they say, we're going to turn your apartment into a condo. Do you want to buy a condo that you can't afford, right? And so these things are happening every day in our communities. And it's not just over the Rhine. This is many, many, many communities in our city and across the country. And y'all can't read this as well. But there's also indirect gentrification. So everything that made it your neighborhood and why you're there is gone. So like, why are you still here? So your laundromat's gone, your corner store is gone, your hair store is gone, your school's gone, your friend's gone, your family's gone, your park's gone, or at least you don't feel like you can use it, right? It's not remade for you. So why are you still here? And your rent's probably going up, right? So making it inhospitable for people to live there is that indirect gentrification. So we have both direct and indirect gentrification happening right now in Cincinnati. And so the stories that we tell are often informed by these types of gentrification. So there's an article that I talk about a lot when people say, oh, well, I went down to Blink and it was really cool to see that everything that's changed. Or I went to Washington Park and isn't it so cool that we saw black and white kids playing in the spray ground, right? But you can't learn to swim in a spray ground. And black kids are more likely to drown because they don't have access to swimming pools. And there's a whole historical body of knowledge around that. In fact, when Marion Spencer and the kids that they were trying to segregate Coney Island was rather closed down for years than like black kids swim there with white kids, right? So it's dangerous that kids can't have access to swimming pools. So one day sometimes we have college students that are interning with us, and I had a student from Mount St. Joe who grew up in Over the Rhine and came to me one day and said, my family just got a notice that they're raising our rent $200 a month, and they're not going to be able to afford that. So fortunately, I don't do the tenant organizing, I do the education stuff. So our tenant organizers got on it, got on the folks, and really tried to push back. Most people still lose their homes, and those folks did. But what was interesting about it is the letter that they got said that we are raising your rents because the park across the street is being renovated. So often people say, well, isn't it nice? Isn't it for everybody? But when they reimagine the park, they don't imagine it for those residents that are there. They imagine it for somebody else. So I'm going to read this, and there's only 3 of these slides where I'm going to read, so it'll be okay. It says, the issue with the renovation of the park is similar to the streetcar. Do you think 3CDC wants to spend millions of dollars, public money, by the way, I should say that, public money, our money, $33 million of public money going into this park, so that people who are living in poverty can enjoy the changes? Or do you think they envision more rich people moving into the neighborhood? It's obvious by their track record of this displacement of economic others, going to econo-side, right, that these changes are only for the rich. Some people say OTR says only the rich, right? This puts us low-income residents in a true bind. We too are enticed by the shiny new park, the shiny new streetcars, the shiny new restaurants. But for many of us, the restaurants are economically out of reach. $15 for a hot dog? Are you serious? Even worse, though, is that these upgrades to Ziegler Park have now been documented as the reason landlords are raising the rents in the area. Families who are being gentrified out of the neighborhood are now scrambling to find housing, while the Homeless Coalition helps organize the tenants to hopefully save their homes. Every time 3CDC puts a multi-million-dollar project in the neighborhood, it jeopardizes the housing of people with low incomes. If they cared about people in the neighborhood, they would create affordable housing rather than these $500,000 or more condos. I can't say who cares and who doesn't care, right? If I wrote this now, I probably wouldn't say somebody doesn't care. Because hyperbole is not necessarily super effective, right? But this is what we hear from people in the community. We hear them saying 3CDC doesn't care about us, right? And so ultimately, people deserve the right to enjoy those public amenities that we've paid for. But unfortunately, it's not seen that way. In fact, when the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra did an event here a couple of years ago, right before COVID, there was a woman who was walking through, a black woman coming back from work. She decided to sit down on a bench and then lay down on the bench. She was physically taken off of that bench, arrested, and got 1 year probation after a long, going to court and all that stuff for being in the park because she laid down on a bench. And, they said she refused to move or something like that. It was a public park bench, right? The fact that she could lay down on it was pretty amazing because hostile design often prevents people from laying down on it, right? So these public spaces, you look at this swimming pool and you say, okay, it's nice, and black kids will use the swimming pool. But before, the kids would pay $4 a year and they could swim at all the CRC swimming pools, right? Now they have to pay $4 a day to swim at the swimming pool. Now there's an everyone in program that 3CDC does to say that everyone can get in. But then you are subjected to, do your parents and guardians, can they come and say that they don't make money and all that kind of stuff, right? And this pool is so big that the CRC, the Cincinnati Recreation Commission, couldn't even afford to keep it up. So if 3CDC gets out of it, it's just going to wither away and become destroyed. And even when 3CDC came in and they said, we want to re-envision this park, they came and said, we're going to do a community input meeting, right? Because that's one of the things that they want to say is they do community input. They took the designs for the park and laid them out on a table, and the swimming pool was on Peasley Neighborhood Center's property, which is back there. And these moms and women saved Peaslee from being demolished back in 1984. And they raised money by singing songs and selling bricks and doing all kinds of stuff like that. And CPS took all the money that they raised and they started at zero, right? And when 3CDC came and showed the swimming pool on top of Peaslee's property, they said, "You want kids to be able to swim, right?" "Yeah, of course, but you're taking our property to do that, and you didn't even ask us," right? So this is why Peaslee, part of the reason they have on the side of their building, it says, "This building is not for sale," right? We're not getting out of here. So yes, people should be able to enjoy the parks, you know, but at the same time, that wasn't the goal of this park. So gentrification is not new, and I'm plugging the Econo side now here because seriously, if you want to get deep into it, please check it out. But it also differs depending on the location. Cincinnati has a very specific type of racism, and it defines the way things are in Cincinnati. I've kind of come up with these eras of Cincinnati homelessness, right? The history of the area goes back 30,000 years. People have been living here, Native American folks. And of course, they weren't allowed to sit at the table when the colonizers came in and built the forts and pushed them back and killed them and basically pushed them in Indiana and then to Kansas and then to Oklahoma, right? And then the year after the state of Ohio was created, the Ohio Black Codes were initiated, meaning if you were a black person and you want to live in Ohio, that you would have to have 2 white people go with you to the courthouse to vouch for you so you get papers to work. And you still could not own property. You could not own a gun. You could not testify against someone in court or have anyone represent you in court. And every year you still had to pay a fine, and for you and your kids. So the state of Ohio was built upon black labor, right? And that led all the way up into the Civil War, right? And then of course, after the Civil War, you've got Jim Crow and redlining and segregation, you know, legally, right? Until 1968. And then the era of mass incarceration that's breaking up communities and families because of this drug war, right? And now we're into this era of gentrification, which this is going to be, when we look back on this era 20 years from now, there's going to be a different name for it. I don't know what the name is, right? It's not going to be reverse white flight or something like that, right? But there's going to be some name for it, and it might be genocide. So we have, of course, you've seen a graphic like this when on the internet, and I've modified this because it's wrong in some ways, right? So they say segregation ended in 1954. Segregation's not ended, right? There's an article in the book about segregation now and showing how the schools are very much segregated still. Most people go to a school that's 90% more one race. 70% is the cutoff, right? And saying it's segregated. There's only one school in our region that's majority black and not segregated. And that's the School for Creative and Performing Arts, which is a magnet school. So I kind of changed this: segregation, legally enforced Jim Crow segregation, right? Mass incarceration, switched that from 54 to 68 and then into gentrification. So one day I got a phone call from Melissa, who you heard from earlier. And she said, "Hey, my friend got a 70-day notice to move out." I'm like, 70-day notice? That's weird, right? I said that most people get 45-day notice. There's a 3-day notice is a thing too, but 70-day notice. I said, "Can you take a picture of it and email, send it to me?" She did. Wow, that was the beginning of a big 3 or 4 year journey that resulted in people losing their home, but fighting for it along the way. So in about 2017-18, there was this company called FC Cincinnati. They're a soccer company, and they're owned by 2 of the most powerful, richest families in our city. The Farmer family and the, I know I'm naming them out here, right? The Lindner family. And if you don't know, both of those families, the Cintas, the Cintas people, Cintas is anti-union over time and all that kind of stuff. And the Lindner family, UDF, has been, accused of everything under the sun, no black management, all that kind of stuff. They also put money to suppress gay rights in the 1990s here in Cincinnati. So those families were saying, look, we want to build a new stadium so that we can become Major League Soccer. We're going to pay Major League Soccer $150 million just to join their club, right? But we want to build the stadium in an urban area. So after the folks in Oakley, which is more of an affluent neighborhood in Cincinnati, they said, we don't want to deal with the traffic. And Newport, Kentucky, which is right across the river, said, we want the stadium here. They even put up a billboard that said, build your stadium here, right? Like they wanted it there, but they weren't having it. So they said, well, we're going to put it in the West End in Cincinnati. And the West End is a neighborhood that has had major waves of displacement, starting with the highway, then going even recently with Hope 6 in 2005, 10,000 people put out of that neighborhood. But it's a majority black neighborhood, low-income families. There's some public housing there, and they came in. But so this was going on in the background, and Melissa says, hey, can you take a look at this? And we said, okay, this is weird. Who is this company that's kicking these folks out of their home in the 70-day notice? So we look it up, and it's an LLC that was just opened, just created. It cost $80 to make an LLC in the state of Ohio. So someone paid $80 to kind of hide their identity, and they end up buying another LLC, and these buildings are in this LLC. So we're like, this is FC Cincinnati, right? Like they're the ones probably buying this. And the person, Fred Berger, he's owned many buildings and over the Rhine over the years, and he's now the management for this. And so it's kind of unclear who owned it, but we thought it was FC Cincinnati. So FC Cincinnati said, no, this is not us. We're not kicking these folks out of their home because we promised that this stadium was not going to displace anybody from this neighborhood. They made this promise before getting millions and millions and millions of dollars of public subsidy. It's not a privately funded stadium. We have bonds that we will be paying over $120 million over the next 10 years. The city will be for the stadium. But anyway, so they come up and they're like, it's not us. So Nick Schwartzel, who I think is off the side of this picture, was a reporter at the time, and he found out that new LLC that bought the building had the same tax address as FC Cincinnati. So when we pointed that out, they said, oh, well, we didn't know anyone lived there. We said, okay, so you decided to kick them out and you didn't know anyone lived there? Like, that's kind of messed up. So then Jeff Birding, who's one of the presidents of FC Cincinnati or owner or something, he busts open the door, that's how they described it, at the Cincinnati Enquirer. Now, Cincinnati Enquirer is one of the few newspapers that are left mass-produced newspapers, Gannett, right, or USA Today, right? And they were even shocked that he went in and said, I want to tell my side of the story. They said, nobody's ever busted into the editorial room and demanded an interview like he did, right? So he gets in there and he says, when my grandparents lost their home in Corryville by University of Cincinnati so that UC could build a dorm, they moved to Westwood, and they had a great experience there where they were to raise their kids. The thing is, as white folks, we can fail up, right? We can fail and things can turn out better for us. But for black folks, that's not an option. You can be successful and still fail in the society when you're black. And so you cannot compare his experience, right? And then he repeated, we said no displacement, but we didn't know people lived there. And then he said, well, if you residents don't leave, then we will not have a handicap accessible entrance to our stadium. Don't you want people that have handicaps to be able to come to the stadium, right? And I'm thinking back to, don't you want kids to be able to swim in the swimming pool, right? Of course, right? But at the same time, that's not what was happening here. So I'll read this real quick. So even more egregious than the previous example is when the news media clearly sides with the oppressor or the agitator. In the case with FC Cincinnati, media outlets were quick to cite false information provided by FC Cincinnati, including that they were working directly with Miss Mary and others to help them through this transition. FC Cincinnati was attempting to hide their new ownership of the buildings, and they were not at all in contact with the residents being displaced other than the notices to vacate the building. There was a woman named Miss Mary who was 99 years old and bedridden, and they were telling her that she had to leave. There was a family with a 15-year-old who drew these amazing editorial cartoons with the mayor, John Cranley, as a little kid, looking with using buildings as blocks and kicking the blocks out of the way, kicking people out of the way, right? You know, kids are understanding what's fair and what's not fair. Like, they understand that, and they're able to show that through that. And these folks fought back and stood up to the most powerful families in our city, and they still lost, right? In 2020, they were pushed out of there. Miss Mary dies a few months later, and her niece says that she died from a broken heart, and she kept asking, when can I go home? This is the type of thing that people are experiencing every day. Now, black folks in this country experience something that's called weathering. So when you are always up against the wall, when you're at the end of your rope, when you're always at crisis, that affects your ability to live a long and healthy life. So in Cincinnati, the life expectancy for black folks is 20 years less than it is for white folks. And this is because of the environmental factors. This is because of redlining in healthcare. This is because of the fact that we have no upward mobility for black people in the city of Cincinnati. We are ranked number 73 out of 77 metropolitan areas for upward mobility for black people. That means there is no upward mobility for black people. Right? So as you can see over here on this side, this is a picture from 1950s, I want to say, like an aerial shot. And you can see the original, up at the top there, you can see the original Laurel Homes, which was one of the first 3 public housing projects in the country. And public housing was created after the Great Depression to stimulate the housing industry. It was not created to provide housing for people. It was to say, look, we can make shiny new buildings that have electricity, right? And they have running water and these modern amenities, right? But they were only for white people, right? You had to be a white married couple with kids that were born in wedlock and have a job to live in public housing when it was created. And the idea is that they would be paying rent, and that rent would upkeep the buildings. Now, unfortunately, that's racist, right? It's pretty racist. So people in the city of Cincinnati sued and said, look, black folks should have access to this brand new, shiny, state-of-the-art public housing. So they said, okay, we'll build you something else. So this bottom squares that are cut out here, I'm gonna walk it here. So this was the original Laurel Homes up here, and this part right here, this might have a thing on it, is Lincoln Court. And Lincoln Court, oh, no, see, that's why we didn't want to do all that.
It's the top button, Mark.
That's
Sorry.
the button I touched.
Oh,
That's the
no.
button I pushed. So Lincoln Court was built so that for black people to live there, right? But even on this map, you can see that the design of it doesn't allow sunlight to come through, like how close those buildings are together. The sunlight doesn't reach the ground, right? And they were shoddily built. They weren't, even though we had already had these Laurel Homes that are shiny and new and all that kind of stuff, they just built these subpar buildings that don't, they're already torn down now, right? Because they were so bad. Whereas those Laurel Home buildings, some of those still exist today as Liberty Street apartments. And in fact, Melissa lives in one of those buildings today. And you can see where the highway came through, and 26,000 people were kicked out of this neighborhood in less than 2 years, and over 25,000 of them were black. And these buildings here, while they were the same Italianate buildings that were built by those German immigrants, and other immigrants, but a lot of German immigrants. Those same Italianate buildings we still have up and over the Rhine, and they're turning into $1-2 million buildings, right? So there was value there. They called them the slums. They said, we're doing you a favor by tearing down this neighborhood and kicking you out, because this is substandard housing. So we're doing you a favor to kick you out. And we still hear that kind of thing today. So it's not inevitable. You can avoid gentrification to some extent, but it is genocide. Econocide is, building on that. But when you change a culture, you remove people from their homes, you explicitly say you want to do that, that's a type of genocide. And they use different development tools, including a community benefits agreement, which you would think would be a thing, but they use that as an excuse, at least in the case of the FC Cincinnati, to erase people's voices, right? Don't get me started on choice neighborhoods. So I really wanted to let you know, policies are not neutral. They're not value neutral. When we make decisions, we're making those decisions based upon specific worldviews, and those worldviews are often clouded by the voices of the most powerful. So a lot of times people say, oh, people want a hand up, not a handout. The Nixon administration came up with that so they could start cutting public benefits, right? So we adopted many of these anti-worker, anti-poverty ideologies, and we don't even realize it, right? But economics reflect our shared values, and the shared American value is anti-Blackness, and that is pervasive in the housing industry on all fronts. So I'm not gonna have time to talk about this, but you all know the book, right? Steal the Street. But criminalization of homelessness is a serious issue, because what it does is it pushes people further into the shadows where they're more likely to be victimized. So you might say, why are people sleeping out in these tents out here? But when people have a community together, they're more safe. They can work together. They can keep tabs on each other. They, that safety net connectivity. But when the police decided that people weren't allowed to be out here and all this kind of stuff, and basically people started disappearing, and we can't get them into housing fast enough. So definitely check out the book. So things that you can do is by examining your privilege, thinking about the things, understanding that white people didn't work harder, right, to get where they are. We have 100 times more wealth because the federal government's policies enabled us to do that by explicitly not enabling Black folks to do that, right? So we have benefited off of this. That we can disrupt these institutions. I want you to put your body between people who are being harmed by institutions and those institutions that harm them, whether that be the police, whether that be a system of education that's failing folks, listening to those voices, getting an alternative break going, understanding that it took us 9 years to get hate crime legislation for people experiencing homelessness in our city. 9 years, right? So if you come and say, I want to volunteer with the Homeless Coalition, well, okay, you might want to make one of work with one of our member organizations. Educate yourself, share the book, Steal the Street, y'all got it, right? And then any situation you're in, ask who's excluded from this. Who's explicitly not in the room who could benefit from this? Think about parents who have single parents who are working 2 jobs, who can't come to that community meeting. They still care, even if they can't show up, right? The equitable development rubric from Peasley, if you're into development, very important. Go ahead and check that out. And then also in the book, there's a neighborhood photographic assessment where if you want to see how does gentrification look, how can I pull out things in the community, check out that activity that's in the book, and you can do that. It's pretty cool. Get involved. Again, we've got these tickets on brown paper tickets for these events in November. Book a speaker. The residency program, Miami students. Now, I think if you're a 3rd year or 4th year, it might be a little bit too late, but you can tell your friends that they can take classes in Over the Rhine and live down there with us, be embedded into community. It doesn't matter what their major is now. We've had journalism students, all sorts of folks, education. You can come, be embedded with a community organization, So reach out to John Blake to talk about that. Take the Sustainable Communities class, learning about what is service learning. That's that one, right? Service learning. And then also next year, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund campaign, you can get involved with that. Action for Housing Now. And we're always looking for submissions for Street Vibes. So if you want to get your artwork published, your poetry, you're writing an article, you want to say, oh, Dr. Mark came to my school and said all this weird stuff, put it in an article and submit it to Street Vibes, right? We're always looking for that. And then challenge and get your families involved, right? Get them talking about stuff. So thank you so much. I think we're at time, right? Yeah. And we're leaving some time for questions. For that, if you want to do a round of applause, we can do that. If it was good enough, online, we can do that too. Time goes by so fast. So that's why you have to do the trainings with us. I think we've got questions and stuff already.
We can start here, and then we'll move into some of the online questions if alumni have them.
Yeah.
You mentioned the land bank, and I had a friend who really championed it, the legislation authorizing it, and he was working in Franklin and Columbus and really thought it would help. It sounds like you think it's gone awry.
Yeah, so what the land bank does is it's a public entity, it's a quasi-governmental county entity, and what they do is they get properties that are either neglected or falling apart, and then they try to stabilize those properties. Sometimes they'll fix them up and then they'll sell them, and what we're seeing is they have a different understanding of what's affordable. For instance, in Walnut Hills on Wayne Street, they fixed up a building and sold it for $460,000. And the people who bought it didn't understand that that was going to start fueling more gentrification out in that area that we're seeing in Walnut Hills. We also know that folks have had their land taken from them by the land bank so that they'll get code violations, and those code violations double and double, and if they don't deal with them, the land bank is able to take that from them. And so the land bank itself is seen as a development tool, but folks, their lived experience is saying that it's taking my property away and it's creating properties that are not. And I know somebody in Evanston who got a land banked house, a white couple, and the mom said, thank God for the vouchers because we wouldn't want to send our kids to the same neighborhood school as the kids on our street. Right? So you've got white folks that are coming into historically black neighborhoods and saying, thank God we don't have to send our kids to the same school.
Which is, by the way, school.
Right.
Operating school.
Right. So that's the thing, yeah.
I know you talked about how gentrification is based on location. Can you talk about, can you sort of explain how homelessness is different by the region, like specifically California? I know there's a big population in the bigger cities.
So the question was, is gentrification looking different in different areas and in big cities? What we find is that people from rural areas and suburban areas often come to the city and then seek assistance that way. So we often end up absorbing the folks that are either LGBTQ folks who are dealing with family rejection. We have folks that are just don't have the economic opportunity out there that they would before, that are looking for that. So those kinds of things are different. But I kind of mean more like the anti-black racism is kind of different in Cincinnati. So there's something called Cincinnati nice that we talk about, right? That people act like everything's okay, but under the current of that, there's this really big anti-black racism happening in housing, but also in education. So it might be different that maybe there's a larger Latino, Hispanic population in California that's experiencing homelessness. In Cincinnati, we are just now starting to see, in the 2010 census, we were basically 50-50 black and white and 5% other. And that includes Asian and Hispanic. And those last census, I don't think it's above 10%, right? So we have a very specific overrepresentation of black folks in the people who are experiencing homelessness, and that's because of these anti-black policies that have existed for a long time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Demographics changed at all in relation to the opioid epidemic? Things have changed a lot in the last 5 years.
So things have, so the the question is, have things changed because of the opioid epidemic? I think the level of services have changed and where people are reaching them, right? So the organizations, even the county has a rapid response team now that's responding to people. We have a lot of training on Narcan that's happening in our communities because that's very important, right? To be able to save their lives. But I think when we think about homelessness, the drug piece is generally because of that isolation, loneliness, and depression that people experience. And we have to focus on what's called housing first, right? Get people into housing and then deal with those issues. There's a great model in Cincinnati. It's called Over the Rhine Community Housing. And they have a recovery hotel and also the Jimmy Heath House. And so they work with people to make sure that they can deal with those after you get into housing. Because you can't deal with the stress of the world when you're sleeping outside and you don't know where you're going to take a shower, you don't know where you're going to eat, you don't know who you can trust. Do we have maybe more white folks from suburbs and rural areas seeking those services in the city? Yes, absolutely. But we also know that homelessness is getting worse because of other factors as well, right? That's just one factor. I think we had some online.
Yeah, we've got some questions from the folks joining us to the stream. One of them is from Alicia Marin Marcial, and it's a little bit long, but I think the context is important. They're talking about their city in Phoenix is considering utilizing police to monitor city parks. Could you point to research related to policing in city parks, please? It seems that this would only increase police budgets, which already has the most funding in most cities in the United States. Does any of the research point to the lack of return on investment on those dollars for policing parks and other public spaces?
Right. So essentially, we know that a person experiencing homelessness can draw about $35,000 in public assistance. So the amount that we spend per year to deal with homelessness costs more than putting people in their homes, like just simply like that. And when it comes to policing, we know that interactions with the police are generally not good for people experiencing homelessness. Whether it's just being told to move on along, or in the case with Joanne Burton, a police officer got a call that someone was drinking a beer in the park and drove his cruiser over her as she was laying in the park, right? That didn't have to happen, right? Or a Gerard Porter who I mentioned, he stole some food from Kroger's. 6 hours later, or a few hours later, they run up, the police cruiser basically runs up at him at the bus stop, and they say he came at him with a knife and they shot and killed him, right? This is what happens when people are interacting with the police, especially people in poverty, white Appalachian folks that know that the police tear their families apart, and for Black folks in general. So when we have already in our parks where we have cameras and surveillance, I thought about how it was so much different when I went to school here and there were no cameras everywhere, and now these are things that you all got to deal with, right? The surveillance culture, right? And the return on the investment is what? So white rich people can feel okay to go to the park, right? What kind of money do you put on that, right? And so I would very much caution. So there's a thing called clean and safe. And this is something they try to do all across the country in business improvement districts or special improvement districts where, they basically just start policing it by having people sweeping up the street, right? So I'm just sweeping up the street, but I can call the police real quick and say, hey, this, right? And so when the encampments were happening in 2018, the police would come, and I got a call early in the morning at 6 o'clock, and they said the police are at the encampment. And my sister, who's also a Miami grad, who's a lawyer, was there, and we went over there, and you trying to be respectful, and I'm asking the police, did you wake up this morning because you wanted to throw people that are already on the street out of their tents, right? Is that what you think policing is for? And they're like, no, I don't want to be doing this, right? But I have to do it because the city said if I don't do it, I could be arrested as a police officer if I don't do this, right? So then we say, okay, we'll call the CAP line, the central access point line. That's the only way you can get into the shelter in Cincinnati. You got to call this phone line. The police call it. Oh, it doesn't open until 9 a.m. Okay, 9 o'clock. Tell the police, call it and see if there's no space for people in the shelter, right? So the police are not the solution to homelessness, right? They're not going to be able to, they might be making it worse in some ways, because the sheriff's the one that shows up at your door and says, well, you've already been evicted, you have to leave, right? So there could be some sort of better conversations in that, but the return on the investment for policing is not reaching the people at the bottom, it's reaching maybe the people at the top, right? You know.
We have another question online, kind of along that same vein. We often hear in Central Ohio that any development and density is good as we are not building at the rate of population growth. In other words, densely even market rate promotes housing affordability. How would you respond to this positioning, especially when the result is often gentrification?
So we often hear from the city of Cincinnati, they put out a report after we were organizing and they were getting mad at us and they were like, okay, we got to do something about these affordable housing people. And they put out a report about affordable housing. And they said, essentially, supply and demand. If we build more supply, that's going to bring down the demand. Now, for those of us who live in neighborhoods like Over the Rhine, Walnut Hills, Coreyville, we've seen giant buildings come up, right? The supply has gone up, but the rent's still going up, right? So that doesn't jive with our experience. And when we know that we're 40,000 units short in our county, maybe if you got to that zero, we weren't short, that building more would bring the rent down. One of the last articles in the book is the White House, the former White House, issued a report on homelessness and repeated what Reagan said, people want to be homeless, that people choose to be homeless because it's nice to live outside, so they find the nicest place to live outside, and that people leave their homes to go live out in the nice places outside because that's what they want to do. And they said that if we remove things like building codes, historic designation, environmental protections, and we've removed those things, then we could build more housing, and the cost of housing in San Francisco would go down 50%. You can look it up, it's in there, they literally said that. But the thing about the demand is artificially inflated by economics being people's values, right? So when people want to live in San Francisco, they're going to pay a lot of money to live in San Francisco because that's what they want to do, right? But the basic problem with supply and demand is that it's super racist. It does not take into account the lived experience of Black people. It doesn't take into account the historical and contemporary anti-Black racism that exists in the housing market or in the lending market as well, right? People are trying to buy houses, get lending, and all that kind of stuff. And there's some really great reports on that show how Black folks, they'll get their house appraised, then they'll take their photos off the wall and they'll put white people up on the wall, and all of a sudden their house is worth twice the value, right? Or you'll have a couple where you have a white person and a Black person, and the white person is a yoga instructor and they can get the loan, but the Black person who has a full-time job is unable to get the loan to buy a house, right? So we can say supply and demand all we want, but that doesn't get rid of the anti-Black racism.
All right, I know we didn't get to all of the questions online, but I want to make sure that we're wrapping up at 7 here. So we will wrap up. Mark, will you be here for a few minutes afterwards
Absolutely.
if folks want to chat?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you everybody online for joining us and in person. Thank you so much, Dr. Mark, for everything you've done.
Cheers. you, thank you.
And then quick shameless plug for the Western Program for Individualized Studies and the Western Center for Social Impact and Innovation. If this is the sort of programming that interests you, that we use an interdisciplinary lens to look at various issues from a number of different angles, then you will like what we do in the Western program because you will be able to design your own major working closely with faculty mentors. Both Mark and I are products of that system. So
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, you rock, y'all. Thank you so much.